Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Welcome to part 10 of my review of Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition by Chaosium. In this video I'll be covering the first half of Chapter 6, Australia. This will encompass arriving in Australia and chasing down the lead to discover Robert Houston's machinations that lead to the city of the Great Race. I will cover the journey all the way to Kunkuri, ending just before the sidetrack scenario Buckley's Ghost. At this stage, the investigators should have a variety of clues that lead them to Port Headland, Kunkuri and the dry interior of Western Australia. It's here where Robert Houston is exploring a lost Yithian city and sending everything he finds there to Sir Aubrey Penhew and Edward Gavigan in Shanghai and London respectively. In order to make the connection to Australia, they need to have spoken to Professor Cowles in the American chapter and seen the photographic evidence provided by Robert Mackenzie, the executor of the McWhirr estate. If they've seen these photographs, then they can potentially find clues in Shanghai that lead them to Australia. There is also a small clue in the map on the wall inside the Bent Pyramid in Egypt, with a ruby marking a point in Western Australia. It then goes into what the Carlisle Expedition did in Australia next. As directed by Nyarlathotep, they never went there as a group, with just Houston appearing there in 1920 and locating the city. Brady and Carlisle were in Perth for a small amount of time in 1919 after fleeing Kenya, though they stayed hidden by dyeing their hair and using disguises. None of this was discovered by Jackson Elias. It gives a timeline of events from Houston arriving in 1920 through to Professor Cowles returning to Sydney in 1925. It then goes into how to run this chapter. There's a recommendation to read the Lovecraft story, The Shadow Out of Time, as this section is roughly based on it. The chapter should involve collecting information from potentially a few places. There are some NPCs that could also accompany the investigators for some or all of the chapter, and these can also be assigned to players in the event that one of them dies or retires for some other reason. It gives a list of all pulp considerations and then it moves on to arriving in Australia. In the 1920s there was no air service to get there, so travel by sea is the only option. It gives details on how they can get there from America, Europe, Egypt and China, and then moves on to the setting itself. It gives us a basic map of the continent and then moves on to 1920s Australia. As told by history, Australia is a modern country built upon ancient roots. Travel distances are huge, with around 2/3 of it being ancient eroded terrain, though most live in the fertile bands on the coasts. It is dry and flat and almost as huge as the United States, with a population of only around 6 million people in 1925. The north is rainforests and the south has snow-capped mountains in the winter. The western foothills is arable land populated by cows and sheep, kept watered by windmill-driven boreholes. The centre of Australia is where many of the surviving Aboriginal Australians live. It is a landscape of sand, stone and spinifex. At this time, Australia is an independent dominion within the British Commonwealth, with an internal federation of states. Since the 1800s there have been many gold rushes in the west, which drew many Chinese settlers. White settlers moved in along the coasts, and many Aboriginal family groups were removed from their land, sent to settlements or even killed. Australia had 6 universities by the 1920s in major cities, and it is generally guided by English law, and the authorities have no idea that a cult is operating within its borders. Though with reasonable evidence, they will act appropriately. There was little in the way of control of firearms until 1931, which required a permit to be bought, and Aboriginal people had to have special licences in order to keep them. In 1925, any Asiatic or African person was prohibited from owning firearms, with a fine being levied or up to 6 months' imprisonment for breaking this law. The weather in Australia ranges from tropical to semi-arid or desert, with daytime temperatures climbing over 43 degrees and nighttime dropping to freezing. It also has wet seasons. The Aboriginal Australian people are descendants of the earliest humans to leave Africa, and white settlers arrived with Captain Cook in 1788. It is a place of racial segregation and of moving Aboriginal people to designated areas, often being chained together for the walk there, where they would be civilised by the Presbyterian Church and their children being used as cheap labour and removed from their parents. Aboriginal beliefs are rooted in something called the dreaming, where their myths emerge with the landscape, things like Ayers Rock, or Uluru as it's actually named. Communication in Australia is done using internal airmail services, as telephones are uncommon. Word of mouth spreads quickly in the outback, and overland telegraph poles run down the middle of northern Australia. Trains are a common mode of transport, though interstate trips were patchy. Steamships are a mode of transport that is used on the coast, and by the end of the 1920s, 500,000 cars were registered. Roads are bad and breakdowns and punctures are common. Motor coaches also operate beyond the reach of the rail network. Roads for cars are few outside urban areas, and it is advised that investigators stock up on supplies before travelling any notable distance. Air travel within the boundaries of Australia is possible, as by 1922 there were 30 companies that can charter aircraft. All state capitals have public transport, using mostly electric trams as well as taxis. Wilderness travel can be done using horses, though camels are a better alternative. After this we move on to the cult in residence, that of the Sambat. Houston at some point came to the realisation that the avatar of Nyarlathotep known as the Haunter in the Dark resembled the Sandbat from Aboriginal dreaming mythology as a foe of Rainbow Snake, the nature god. The Mardajara, an Australian Aboriginal group's cave, is where the city of the Great Race is, and they know the Sambat as Hungry Wing, and to the east it is known as Face Eater. The feared cult has been reorganised and integrated into Houston's own cult that honours the Haunter in the Dark. Houston often recruits cultists from the slums of Sydney and Melbourne, and has formulated a personality test that each recruit must pass, and consequently several hundred cultists can be found in Australia. Houston sacrifices innocent Aboriginal Australians that are snatched from the Pilbara goldfields far to the west, and the cult murders are performed with clubs made from polished eucalyptus studded with nails. Those who reside in the Great Sandy Desert have clubs embedded with thorns, bat teeth and bat claws. Houston is the only priest of the cult, though there are a few cultists that have spells. Stats for cultists are provided at the end of the chapter. Here it shows us what the symbol of the Sambat looks like, and it can be found stamped on crates, tattooed on cultists and carved on victims. Okay, now we move on to the Dramatus Personae from the Australian chapter. I will go into these people and things more when we reach their relevant section in the book, but I'll provide a quick overview here. Firstly, we have the potential allies. There's Professor David Dodge, who could serve as a replacement PC should things turn out that way. Robert Mackenzie, a former friend of Arthur McWhirr. Jeremy Grogan, an insane, wild-eyed ex-miner and dreamer who has a strange power over a pack of dingoes. And finally, perhaps the most bizarre ally in the whole campaign, a member of the Great Race called Kakakakatak, who has been enslaved by Houston and wants to return her mind back to her original era and thinks she knows how to. She may bargain with the investigators in order to get help. We then have the Adversaries. Firstly, there's Mortimer Whitecroft and his three daughters, Gertie, Shula and Janice. They are associated with Houston, who is known as the mysterious American called Carver to them, and he has an unhealthy love of the Lost City. Him and his daughters are all avid sandbag cultists. This is followed by Robert Houston, who has been covered many times throughout the campaign. A Freudian psychologist, he loathes humanity's petty problems and kills without compunction in the name of Nyarlathotep, and he longs for the moment when the Great Gate opens. He believes that his intelligence and loyalty will spare him when the horrors emerge. He is sorely mistaken. It also covers some minor NPCs, such as Toddy Randolph, an alcoholic businessman who owns Randolph Shipping Company, and Billy Burraglong, an Aboriginal Australian who works for Toddy and can be convinced that Toddy is working with truly evil people. The next section is called Visiting 5 Cities. This covers the 5 possible places that the investigators can find information, that being Perth, Sydney, Darwin, Port Headland and Kunkuri. Each of these is discussed and includes what can be gained from there. The first up is Perth. Nothing of specific note for the campaign can be garnered from here, although they may meet someone who remembers bumping into Jack Brady and Roger Carlisle when they stopped over on their way to Hong Kong. Perth serves more as a springboard to get to the other important places in the campaign. The next is Sydney. It's here where they can travel to the home of Professor Cowles, who they may have met in America. He could have provided them with a letter of introduction to speak to David Dodge, though he may require a good charm or persuade roll to convince him otherwise. Dodge is eager to find out what Cowles has discovered in America and will show them McWhirr's diary. Robert Mackenzie is mentioned in the diary, and Dodge can confirm that he is a mining engineer and friend of McWhirr and will be happy to introduce them to Robert Mackenzie in person should they desire to. Arthur McWhirr's diary is illustrated on these pages here, and it can provide the exact coordinates to the city of the Great Race, also suggesting that the cult of the Sambat was behind the attacks on McWhirr's party. There are other places the investigators can visit while in Sydney, such as the Australia Museum, where they can discover Aboriginal artefacts that depict a great entity with bat-like wings and a 3-lobed red eye, and also Polynesian collections that indicate a sunken city. They can go to the State Library and with a successful library use roll can find songs and diaries that point towards a city beneath the Great Sandy Desert of Western Australia, a city built by the gods that were vanquished by the wind. There's the National Art Gallery, which will have an Aboriginal Australian collection that depicts a petroglyph showing a dying man, body bloated and black, surrounded by figures holding jagged clubs. This will be explained by the curator as depicting a ritual sacrifice of a cult of bat worshippers. Lastly, there's the University of Sydney, where they can gain the leads of Anthony Cowles or David Dodge, should they not already have them. Next, it shifts to Darwin. Should the players visit Port Headland first, the information here should be relocated there, most especially the Randolph Shipping Company. Darwin at this point can be depicted as a sweltering tropical shantytown full of fights, shady characters and dodgy deals. Rumours can come from all quarters here, and the investigators will need to use their full array of social skills to find out information that is listed here. They can discover that some Aboriginal Australians in the Great Sandy Desert are worshipping a bat god, and that corpses have been found that were clearly diseased and covered in tiny puncture wounds. It's also rumoured that a white madman leads the cult, and that an Aboriginal tale tells of a magnificent city hidden in the Great Sandy Desert, and that Budai, a great old man, sleeps beneath it, and he will one day awaken and devour the world. It's attributed to Johnny Big Bush, who is said to work in Darwin at the Randolph Shipping Company. After this, we move on to the Randolph Shipping Company itself. There are a number of ways to find out about Randolph Shipping in most of the other chapters, and investigators will discover that it is a dockside building owned by Toddy Randolph. He holds various goods, some of which are illegal, and of which would get him in trouble with the authorities if it was found out. He employs Billy Burraglong, who is inquisitive by nature and not scared to ask difficult questions. Randolph himself lives in the warehouse, and it is a dirty place. Should the investigators ask about Johnny Big Bush, Randolph will tell them that he was troubled and that he fired them a few weeks ago. If they are in the warehouse when questioning him, a successful spot roll will note a crate addressed to the Penhew Foundation, marked with the symbol of the sambat, which they will recognise if they've been to London. If a crate is knocked over by accident, or indeed by accident, it will break open and a grotesque wooden idol that looks to be of Aboriginal manufacture will be amongst the broken crate. It is a crude idol of Cthulhu. Though Randolph is motivated by greed, Burraglong is a good person who would be aghast to find out the truth of his boss's business dealings. He can be convinced of this if met outside the warehouse, and can actually be used as a replacement investigator if called for. Should the investigators break into Randolph Shipping Company, they'll find nobody there to stop them. A search will reveal Randolph's account book for 1925, which will show shipments to Mortimer Whitecroft in Kunkuri marked with the symbol of the sambat. These travel to Port Headland and then inland. Also of note will be shipments to Arja Singh in Mombasa, Penhew Foundation in London, and Ho Fang in Shanghai. They will notice, if they disturbed the crate earlier, that the note for the Penhew Foundation states that there are actually 2 crates to be shipped to them. If they search the place, after an hour they will find it and discover it contains a strange device composed of wheels, mirrors and rods with a sealed letter addressed to Edward Gavigan. This item is used to contact minds by the Great Race of Yith and is fully detailed in Appendix D. It also provides us with some pulp considerations and a map of the building. The next stop on the journey is Port Headland. This is a small town in Western Australia that has a population of around 300. A natural harbour, it serves as a terminus and port facility for a small railroad. It's 150 miles from Kunkuri, and it also has a recently constructed airfield that provides flights to Perth. Everything should ultimately point to here, where they should travel on to Kunkuri and then onto the city of the Great Race. The whole aim of being here is to meet with Robert Mackenzie, though having Professor David Dodge in tow or a letter of introduction from Professor Cowles should make this meeting run smoother and possibly allow them to stay at his house. Mackenzie was a friend of Arthur McWare, an executor of his estate, already knowing about his discovery in the desert. He advises that McWare was convinced of his discovery and was honest and upstanding. Those trained in psychology may figure out that he has some doubts about McWare's claims, and he does know the exact coordinates of the city, though since he lost his friend to influenza, he has not felt the need to journey there. He will mention a curious meeting with an American a few years ago called Mr. Houston, who suggested he was a friend of Arthur and knew of his material. He let Mr. Houston borrow some of his friend's items and then he vanished. If the investigators have a photograph of Houston, Mackenzie will recognise him. Mackenzie can be of great assistance in preparing for their journey into the desert and can arrange vehicles in Kunkuri and supplies, which could lead them to the attention of Mortimer Whitecroft. It gives some considerations as to Robert B.F. Mackenzie, as this character appeared in the Lovecraft story The Shadow Out of Time, explaining that he is around 40 years old here and around 50 in the story. Next we move on to Kunkuri. Lying south of Port Headland, it is a bustling mining town that caters to prospectors and their animals, trucks and ladies of the night, that can be reached by rail from Port Headland, taking around 8 hours. It is an open car and the land is scorched, parched dry. At some point in the journey, the investigators spot 3 very large birds circling in the distance, though the bumpiness of the train prevents any kind of spyglass from identifying them. When they arrive in Kunkuri, they can do all the things they need to do with regard to getting supplies and transport, as well as local gossip using the usual array of social skills. Some of the rumours are interesting. They can hear about a mining disaster where 25 men were killed, among them someone called Darby Dave the Welshman, who had worked for Mortimer Whitecroft. They can also find out about a crazy American man who took a crew of 24 men into the bush and had them dig a 30-foot shaft, and that creatures the size of bears had stolen cattle east of the Percival Lakes area. They can find out about the Slatteries, who live by Dingo Falls, being quite unfriendly. This is connected to the Buckley's ghost sidetrack scenario that I will be covering in the second part of this chapter, and also about an American man called John Carver, a Robert Houston pseudonym, performing exploratory digs among the Canning stock route. They can also find out about the 3 huge birds the investigators may already have seen, with the teller saying they were around 20 foot at the wing and that a ghost has been seen near Dingo Falls. This is told by someone called Mad Ginger Muldoon, and again is information on the Buckley's ghost sidetrack. They can also find out the rumour that Mortimer Whitecroft was the person who outfitted the mine shaft that was dug by the American, and that 4 or 5 years ago a man claimed he'd found huge square blocks of stone in the desert that wasn't the work of the natives. Lucky investigators will find out his name, McWhirr. Should they do research into Bill Buckley, they'll find out about a ghost supposedly seen near Dingo Falls. Mad Ginger Muldoon can relate the story if plied with drink. He recalls just 4 nights ago being camped near Dingo Falls, a waterhole with no dingoes near it, and was awoken not by the Slatteries, a family of ne'er-do-wells who live nearby, but by a glowing white man with flesh falling off his bones that advanced on him. He falsely claims he fought it off with a stick. He actually ran away and hid. At sunrise he went back for his gear and it had gone. A few locals may remember Buckley. Indeed, a trip to the mining office will turn up a telegram that says he vanished in 1922 and was last seen in Kunkuri. It's assumed he died in the desert, and he was part of a team with Vern Slattery around 20 years ago, a local drunkard who is known for taking an Aboriginal Australian wife who lives with his sons not far from Dingo Falls. If any local Aboriginals are questioned, they have seen Buckley's ghost, knowing it as the tortured white man, and avoid it. The next part we shift to is Mortimer Whitecroft's shop. He has an outfitting business that sells everything mining related from clothing to truck parts, and lives with his 3 daughters, Gertie, Shula and Janice, who lounge beside the store, on occasion pumping petrol when it takes their fancy. Under his bed he has a copy of Wondrous Intelligences, a mythos tome that describes the great race of Yith. The Whitecrofts will mercilessly pursue and kill anybody who steals it. If the investigators ask any questions of Whitecroft, he will not answer anything, though those trained in psychology will be able to pick up his clear insanity and lies with regard to having ever met Robert Houston as John Carver. His daughters are all cultists who have cult clubs hidden away and are ruthless and vicious when they need to be. They depart for the city shortly after the investigators arrive at Kunkuri. Finally, we have a map of the major trails and walks of Canning Basin, which shows all the relevant areas. Okay, that concludes part 1 of the Australian chapter. Part 2 will be the conclusion of the Australian chapter, with the sidetrack scenario of Buckley's ghost and finishing with the lost city of the Great Race.